For an injectable drug product, clinical filling is one of the most important steps in the transition from the lab to clinical trials. It's important to focus on what the goal is at hand and getting material produced, but also putting processes in place, robust processes in place that can stand the test of time and really start thinking and planning for success. My name is Garath Duffy, and I'm head of supply chain management and project management in Fedder's development site in Rankweil, Austria. We work with a lot of customers who are looking for that very first clinical fill or specifically filling material for clinical trials of their product. So this transition from drug substance to drug product is a major step in the development of a product. And for a lot of the customers that we deal with, this molecule really is like their baby. It's like their child. They've been nurturing it in their lab environment for so long. The volumes that they've been dealing with in the lab environment have been tiny, minuscule. There it was all about understanding the molecule. Now it's about getting it into a delivery system. A lot of aspects and complexity will come on top of what they've been used to up till now. The very first clinical fill is about so much more than just producing 1,000 vials for a clinical trial. The timeline for further clinical trials right up to commercialization is really dependent on this first clinical fill. You've been working a lot on getting funding to get this far. Now you can start thinking about that next step, getting funding in place for the next clinical trials that you need to think about. And all of these milestones get triggered with filling that very first fill and getting that material on stability and getting it into humans for the very first time. Getting your product ready for clinical trials at this stage is critical, and the complexity is a lot more extreme than you've seen in a lab environment. But if we focus on just 4 key areas, we can certainly make that journey a lot less painful and maybe even easier. These 4 key areas, for example, are setting up a proactive plan, planning for success, but also planning efficiently and smartly. Preparing your product for production, not just in terms of volume, but in terms of your understanding of the characteristics of that product. You want to make sure that you really have the right expertise at the table at the right time. Then you'll want to definitely implement best practices. The regulatory field is changing constantly, so getting the right information at the right time and making sure that you're performing under current good manufacturing practice is key. So the key at this stage of building a proactive plan is, on the one hand, keeping that goal in mind of getting clinical material produced, but also not losing sight of the fact that there will be a stage after that. And moving from the lab environment into this first container for the very first time for human use trials, you're laying the groundstone for further manufacturing processes. The decisions that you make now will impact that further down the line. So you want to plan smartly for now, but also efficiently for the future. A typical clinical project can take anywhere from 3 right up to 12 months, depending on complexity. The degrees of complexity that we see coming in terms of compounding, the filling process itself can extend that, but typically we see 3 to 12 months as being standard for clinical projects. At this stage with the clinical manufacturing, there are a number of methods that you'll need to transfer from your drug substance manufacturer to your drug product manufacturer. At a basic, it's purely the safety tests. But there's a lot of work that will be needed to be performed there, and in terms of protocols, testing, and also getting material there for the CMO to put on test. So make sure to factor that in. So a key part of the project plan that your CMO will put together for you will be when certain pieces of information are needed from you. As you move through the clinical development of your product, the requirements will change in terms of what information and product data you need to provide. For very early phase, the requirements may be lower, but start thinking about what you'll need later on. You will need material for testing to fulfill these requirements. You'll need to put a lot of material on stability, more than you think you'll need. When putting the batch size numbers together and putting those into your plan, it's important to consider the material needs above and beyond purely clinical material for the trial itself. Start thinking about material above and beyond that for methods development, for transport studies, for stability. Don't underestimate how much material you will need. Always produce more. The more you have, the better. And the more data you can gather at this stage, the better you can set yourself up for future success. Being in the aseptic field and requiring sterile filled material does increase the complexity of the material no end. There'll be a lot more safety data required, not just from a product safety perspective, but also in terms of exposure limits and so on. So your understanding of the product and how it behaves in a manufacturing environment will be critical at this stage. coming from a lab environment, you will have a good understanding about the safety of the molecule and its excipients. But now we're moving into a manufacturing facility, so you'll need to consider things like cross-contamination, cleaning validation, how safe is your product in terms of exposure limits and so on. So collecting that data early, it will be critical. Your CMO will ask you for this information. So the earlier you can get a grip of that, the better. They're bringing a product into what is most likely a multi-product facility. So their requirements in terms of cross-contamination control will be higher than you're used to in a lab environment. You'll know how it behaves in terms of safety for operators, but now we're in a much more diverse and complex environment. So the more information you can collect on your product, the better. Your CMO may require you to perform technical runs to gain information and experience with the product before going into that first for human use fill, to de-risk a lot of those activities. The more information you have and the more information you share with your CMO, the more information they can have to really optimize the processes and put a plan in place to streamline that activity and really work efficiently. Moving from a lab environment into this manufacturing facility and for clinical manufacturing, you will need to put together a multidisciplinary team to cover the wide diversity of topics that you'll be faced with, from analytical, regulatory, but also through process development and so on. And it's important at this stage to get the right people at the right table at the right time to make sure that the decisions you make and the processes you put in place are the right ones and have been thought through. So in terms of getting the right team together to guide you through this complex phase, you have a number of different options. Either an internal role, or you have the options of looking to external support for this, either by hiring consultants who can come in and provide you with very specific focused support for a key work package or for a defined time, or look to your CDMO to provide these support structures. Focusing on consultants for a second, they're highly trained, highly specific market experts who can come in and support you with not only their experience and knowledge, but also with a wide network that they've built up over time to guide you through this phase. On top of hiring a consultant for a specific role in your team, you can also hire consultants who can help you source the right partners that you'll need to move through the next phase. Whenever you're selecting the right CDMO for your product, you need to be aware of what characteristics the product has, and choose someone who can specifically support you through that. You need to consider at this stage that you've worked a long time getting the material to where it is now, so you don't want to take risks on this next step, which is to a large extent one of the most critical in your product's development. So don't trust that material to a semi-professional filler. You want to make sure that you're choosing a professional CDMO at this stage, especially if your product is going into injectabilia and needs a aseptic process. But also if it's more complex or has certain sensitivities, you want to make sure that your CDMO has a highly robust quality track record, as well as having the capabilities that your product will need. So bringing the material into a clinical and filling environment at this stage, you want to make sure that the CMO you've chosen is keeping up with the current good manufacturing processes, CGMP. This is a field that's changing rapidly. The requirements for fillers are changing constantly, and you want to make sure that the CMO that you've chosen has a solid quality back record, but is also maintaining the standards that they need to produce for human use material. The C in CGMP stands for current, because the regulations and the field that we're in is changing constantly. If we had to break the CGMP framework down into three main components, we could call them qualification, validation, and documentation. So qualification in terms of making sure that the equipment and the personnel that are handling your valuable product are qualified to a standard that's needed to produce for human use material. Validation in terms of making sure that the processes you're putting in place will stand the test of process validation further down the line. And documentation, making sure that all of the documentation that's performed around the clinical fill is up to the highest regulatory standards that we have. So in my role as a project manager for a lot of these early phase products, we put together that multidisciplinary team in our core team to really ask the right questions and put together all of the documentation and processes that we need to fill for human use material successfully. So my advice to one of our early phase customers, to any of our early phase customers, would really be don't underestimate material needs and always plan for success. Making the right decisions now will save you time and headaches further downstream. The very first clinical fill is about so much more than just producing 1,000 vials for a clinical trial. It's about getting that material in its final packaging form for the first time potentially, and also getting that material on stability and seeing how it behaves over a longer period of time in a container closure system. But also generating material and data for stability trials later on, for method transfers, for method development of how to measure and test that material in a larger scale drug product environment. A successful clinical batch is all about striking the right balance of doing it efficiently, but also doing it right. Make sure you give yourself the time that you need.